Okay, I guess I'll start. So hello, welcome to this final conversation in dieDAS's third annual Walk and Talk program. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Wava Carpenter of Design Miami and Anava projects. And before I bring in our fabulous speaker, I'd like to mention that we might be able to take some questions at the end from the audience, so feel free to write your questions in the chat box. So now I'm very pleased to introduce Fernando Laposse. Based in London, Fernando studied product design at Central St. Martin's over the course of his still quite young career. His work has been already exhibited in the Triennale de Milano, the Cooper Hewitt Museum, Design Museum London, Victoria and Albert, the World Economic Forum, Design Miami, and many more places as well. And his work can be found in the permanent collections of the V&A and SF MoMA. So Fernando specializes in working with humble materials, usually like plant fibers, sisal, corn leaves, etc. And everything he does is the result of sort of extensive research that honors the relationship between materials and their heritage and the people connected to them. He is known most especially for his work with indigenous communities in Mexico that create economic opportunities while also raising awareness about the challenges that they face in a globalized world. So hello, Fernando. It's really nice to see you. Thank you so much. Please dive in. Tell us more about your work.
Hello, Wava. Thank you for having me, and thank you, dieDAS, for putting all of this together. I'm really glad to be invited to talk about my work here. If you don't mind, maybe we can jump straight into a presentation, so we can get straight to it, and then maybe have more time for some follow-up questions, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds great. Please go through the presentation, and afterwards, either I will ask you questions, or if people share questions in the chat box, I will ask those questions on their behalf.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. Can you all see my screen there? Perfect. So yes, thank you for the introduction. So again, my name is Fernando Laposse. I spend my time between London, Mexico City, in a very, very small town in the middle of the mountains in Mexico called Tonawixla, which will be heavily featured in today's presentation. So yeah, I think I was always very interested in material design. And I've always really loved working with materials and with my hands directly, and giving context to the material. So today, I would like to speak mostly about two projects, the first being Totomoxtle. So Totomoxtle is a project that started around 2015, and essentially it is a new veneering material, which is made with the husks from endangered species of corn from Mexico. The colors that you see in these sort of protective leaves that grow around the grain are completely natural. There is absolutely no dyeing or painting process of any sort. The color comes directly from the plant. And this is one of the characteristics that make these varieties of corn so special. So to work with these material, I tend to flatten it, cut it, and I was very inspired by traditional, sort of more European marquetry techniques, whereby you would use a combination of different exotic woods together to create decorative surfaces. It's a bit like making a jigsaw puzzle. And for me, it worked because, you know, traditionally you're always using very expensive woods where you're not able to get, you know, large planks from them or large pieces of veneer. So it's more individual pieces that come together to create continuous decorative surfaces. So, you know, I employ this marquetry technique to make furniture. And it's a very sort of labor-intensive process. I like to also think of myself as a craftsman as well as a designer. So I like to be personally involved in most of the production of my pieces, at least in the developing stages. And I am a big believer in craft and a big believer in the value that the human touch can give to an object. So, we do everything from the marquetry to also the carpentry in my studio. And it's really, products of labor of love, you can say about them. So these are some pieces that I've done for one of the galleries that I work with, which is Freeman Benda in New York. I also have developed sort of a modular system that is more, it has sort of applications that go more towards covering interior surfaces and walls. So it's a tiling system that has already quite a few individual pieces of corn glued to them, and then they can come together to create seamless continuous surfaces. So these are mostly used for interior walls. And almost it's a mixture between a wallpaper and a wall tile. But I think what's really particular about them is that you have that seamless joint where most tiles you can tell they repeat fairly easily. Here they really blend into one continuous surface. But more than the individual pieces, which I'm sure you can get more of that in my website or through my Instagram, I would like to focus this presentation on kind of the story behind this material, because I really see this as a whole system approach. And this is the sort of combination or collaboration of skills between myself as a designer, the world's largest seed bank, which holds the largest collection of maize seeds in the world, and a small indigenous village in the southwest of Mexico. And I think for our listeners to really get a feel of sort of the depth of the project, I have to talk a little bit about the history of corn. So essentially corn is considered the first man-made plant because the ancestor of corn, let's just say there is no wild corn in nature that looks anything like what we have today as modern corn. The image on the left is the closest wild relative to our modern maize, which is called teosinte. And it looks, if you look at it closely, almost more like a wheat or like a small grass. It had very few grains. It was nutritionally very uninteresting. And so it's believed that about 9,000 years ago, some ancient Mesoamerican in the central valleys of Mexico had this discovery of a mutated teosinte, which had the ability to produce a lot more seed. It was one plant mutation that caught the eye of an ancient Mesoamerican who proceeded to take a seed from this plant, and by planted it, they started a whole process of selective breeding, which has yielded 56 completely genetically diverse varieties in Mexico in today's time. And these varieties are crucial not only for crop biodiversity, but also for the rich Mexican gastronomy and food, and obviously they are paramount to most of our contemporary indigenous traditions. So they're not only very valuable as plants, but they're also very valuable as vessels of culture, let's just say. And because this plant is some sort of like man-made plant, it also has an abnormal consumption of nutrients from the ground. If you don't combine corn with other plants, or you are not mindful about the nitrogen consumption of this plant, you can completely exhaust your soil in a very, very quick way. So what ancient Mexicans, let's just say, found out was that by combining corn with beans and with pumpkins, you would get a system where you wouldn't have to have crop rotation. You could plant this all year around. The beans would fix nitrogen into the soil. The pumpkins would block sunlight from the ground and would prevent weeds from growing. So it's a 3-in-1 system, which replaces fertilizers, which replaces pesticides and herbicides. The chemicals that are widely used in today's industrial agriculture. So in a way, the milpa system is a perfect example of indigenous technology, which has allowed Mexicans to plant corn uninterrupted for 9,000 years. And it's a system that has survived uninterrupted until the 21st century, which is pretty impressive. probably the epitome of the system, that's its highest manifestation, was the city of Tenochtitlan, which was the Aztec capital, where you had floating cultivation fields with the milpa system and some sort of like indigenous hydroponic system, which was unfortunately destroyed when the Spanish colonized the Aztecs. But this is what, indigenous agricultural technology in the 1500s was looking like. I think one of the problems that we're seeing worldwide is that corn is no longer planted as food. Corn has become this sort of non-food material. It's the most planted grain in the world, but most of it is planted to produce corn syrup, dextroses for processed food, ethanol, and more recently, bioplastics. And well, of course, animal feed. So most of the corn production is just destined to fatten cows. So a radically different way of how we see corn in Mexico. The thing is, in the last 25 years, we've lost most of these native varieties that we have in Mexico. This has greatly been because of new free trade agreements that Mexico has established with the United States and Canada, where essentially the Mexican agricultural market was completely open to competition with the American market, where corn is produced in a very large industrial scale using primarily GMO seeds and hybrids, and with a lot of chemical additives to grow that. So essentially, when Mexico entered into this deal, the price of corn all of a sudden was slashed by 2/3, which meant that people had to plant almost at least twice as much to make the same money as the year before. And so this really put huge pressures onto small scale farmers that all of a sudden had to produce a lot more. And the only way of doing so was by using chemicals. This would be a good time to introduce the story of Tonawixtla, which is the small village that I collaborate with in this project. Tonawixtla is a very arid town in the middle of the mountains, in the Mixteca Mountains in the southwest of the country. And it sits about 80 kilometers from the oldest archaeological site of corn domestication. So it really sits at the heartland of where corn was first tamed by men and where this process of selective breeding started. So it's an area that historically has always had people that have really understood the interconnections of their natural environment and their plants. And it's a really wonderful place. I sort of had the privilege of going to Tonawixtla when I was 6 years old because of Delfino, Delfino was a man that used to work for my father. He invited my parents and my sister and myself when we were about 7 to go and, visit the town. This was the first time that I got to enjoy and learn about indigenous agriculture. And for me, as a, let's say, white Mexican coming from Mexico City, was like going into another world. And I think that's something that is really special about Mexico, that you have this huge diversity of people and ways of living. So for me, that was a very life-changing experience. And going to Tonawixtla became sort of our summer camp. I went every single year until I was in my teens when I eventually moved to Europe. And for me, it was very, very shocking to go back to Tonawixtla after about 15 years of not being there and to see how much the town had changed. Most of the cornfields had been abandoned. This was in great part due to erosion and, a lot of the environmental problems that came with this switch from the traditional agriculture to this industrial agriculture following all of these market changes in Mexico. So for me, that was quite shocking. And for me, what was also very shocking is to see that the environmental crisis triggered a migration crisis where most of the people left the village, ironically, to go work in the United States. So I think it's really interesting to see how global market changes can affect subsistence farmers with these devastating ecological consequences. For me, it's really interesting to be able to zoom in and out and to see, you know, this macro effects having this profound sort of impact in this micro communities. So this is a quick clip, 1 minute video. I hope you can hear the audio, but otherwise there's subtitles in it. And so this is Delfino, who has now become a community leader in Tonahuixtla, explaining some of these issues.
Aquí nosotros estamos abandonados. Lo más triste también es de que nosotros lo que cultivamos aquí tampoco ya no se puede vender. Dicen que es mejor el maíz que viene de la industria, que el maíz de acá pues no pesa mucho y la gente pues ya no quiere cultivar. Ya no quiere trabajar, mejor se va. Yo recuerdo que se cultivaba y había mucha tierra fértil, pero desde el momento que vino la industria de fuera, ya vino a cambiar todo. Todos los químicos que se le aplica a la planta, al maíz, al frijol, vino a erosionar también la tierra. Ya veo que en vez de árboles o tierra para cultivar, hay piedras. Aquí están creciendo las piedras en vez de árboles. Pero ya nos dimos cuenta que ese químico nos está afectando y por eso decidimos cambiar.
So I think Delfino has a very kind of poetic way of speaking about erosion. You know, this idea of having rocks growing instead of trees is a very powerful image. But I think it was part of the project is also about explaining migration effects and also looking for ways of activating the women, you know, which have become the town's sort of post-migration population, as most of the men have migrated. So this is another quick clip with Esmeralda, who's one of the women that work in our workshop, and she's going to be talking a little bit about this. Esmeralda has a personal experience of having lost 2 brothers that migrated to the States and never made the trip. So, you know, it's a very real thing that most of the families have had to deal with in this village.
Hay veces que hay años que no ves a tus hijos que se van a Estados Unidos a trabajar y simplemente en el camino pierden la vida. Y sería muy bonito que el día de mañana hubiera un trabajo, hubiera una estabilidad para nosotros, para que también nosotros no tengamos esa necesidad de buscar algo económico en otro lugar. La mujer se dedica a estar en la casa, a cuidar los niños, no tiene un papel relevante, digamos, porque nunca aportamos algo económico. Para mí es un orgullo pertenecer al grupo que está conformado la mayoría por madres jóvenes. Contamos con un ingreso que posiblemente es un poquito más elevado a lo que viene trabajando un hombre. Los horarios son muy accesibles para nosotras, ya que les podemos dedicar tiempo a la familia.
So in a way, it was about activating these women, you know, providing a source of employment that is seriously changing gender roles in the village. And I think the project is also about humanizing migration. You know, I think there's a lot of cliches of why people migrate from Mexico. It's often, you know, the myth is like it's always linked to violence, or it's always linked to them being economic migrants. But the reality is that the majority of indigenous rural migrants are not escaping violence. And I think they are rather victims of a global system that has made their traditional lifestyle completely incompatible with today's, you know, pace. So we're looking at ways of resolving this, or at least addressing this. So I think the aim of the project is to create a new source of revenue with the husks. And this is done to incentivize farmers to reintroduce these native corns by relieving them from the pressures of the market demand for cheaper industrial grain. And it's also about giving local women this flexible employment. And flexible being a big key word here, because we don't want to, you know, make a factory here. It's donating or creating employment whenever they want to work and whenever they have time, when they're not taking care of their families. So the results of the project so far have been we have reintroduced 8 species of corn. This has mainly been done through the partnership that we created with the CIMIT, who has always been a great support of the program. We've created a communal composting center to create new soil, to produce also organic fertilizers, to help with the development of the corn. And we're also trying to engage the younger community to follow up on what we're doing. And when we were talking about incentivizing the farmers, we really are doing so because so far, 1 square meter of totomoxle is the equivalent in cost of, over a ton of grain. So it's just such a massive markup that we're creating with this raw material that it's all about giving them that independence from not being dependent in a market, which will always, they will always have a disadvantage in this sort of industrial commerce. So for me, it's also about creating a system that is fit for the local infrastructure. These are, low-tech solutions for a town where, you don't have the privileges of having very complicated machines that need a lot of repairing. So for me, innovation is not necessarily about technology, but it's about creating new systems that are fit for these realities. These are some images of the workshop, for example. We've developed a lot of new systems where, a lot of sort of the design process has been about not so much focusing on the end material, but creating a design toolkit where anyone in the village can become a craftsperson after a few days of being trained. So we have a system of, cutting dies that basically correct a lot of the human error to make sure that everyone can join the team without necessarily being super experienced craftspeople. And the goal with this project is not to appropriate an existing craft, but rather create a new craft and create new craft people in a town where, you didn't really have craft. And this is obviously to empower them and give them financial independence. For me, it's always been really important to be personally involved in all the harvests. And I think, we've been able to develop a lot of sort of design solutions directly on the field. So for example, the machine on the right is a circular blade that we put on top of a bench to be able to cut the husks really effectively or really precisely directly on the field. So we produced about 10 of these benches and we lend them around the town so everyone can process their corn directly on their field. It's also about encouraging families to be involved in every step of the production chain. So we have a lot of families that are both farmers and workers in the workshop. And it's also about providing hope for returning migrants so they can see a future in their community and traditions. In our team in the workshop, about half of them are returning migrants from the past 5 years, a lot of them deported. So it's also about creating, an environment where they feel safe, where they feel empowered, and where they see a future. So, we have an audience from all over the world, and you might be wondering, well, why should I be concerned about what happens in this tiny village in the other side of the world? And the answer is we should all be concerned about this because it's estimated that we've lost about 80% of all the agricultural variants of fruits, vegetables, and grains in the last century. It took, thousands of years of agriculture to develop, and in only a century, we've lost most of them. The problem with this is that the least varieties, the more vulnerable we're going to be to climate change, pandemics, global plagues, etc. So the more diversity, the more security. So we need to be able to protect environments where you still have diverse agriculture and indigenous knowledge. So I think now I want to hop to the second project that I want to briefly talk about. This is my work with agave fibers, which I call vegan horsehair. So this is a quick video of how I work with this. It's essentially working with agave, which is a desertic plant, where we use the leaves to produce fibers. The way of producing these fibers, Now we have a machine to do this, but this is a video of when I started to work with this project. So it's just about, getting rid of the green part of the plant, and then you're left behind with all of these fibers. So with this, we've been able to create furniture. I mean, now we have a much more sort of clean way of working with this. This is when I was just starting the project. But for me, it was also presenting these fibers in an innovative way, not just creating traditional textiles or turning them into threads, but more allowing this to be, more in its hair-like quality. So the idea is to create all of these sort of animal-like pieces of furniture. So these are benches. These are the same benches, but dyed with cochineal, which is a natural dye made with insects that grow in a cactus. So, I try to be as eco as possible when I make all of these decisions of combining materials. And you might have seen this installation that I made for Design Miami 2019. So this was all about showing this power of dyed agave fibers to create these monkeys and hammocks. But now I try to move the project back to Tonawixla. So what I'm doing at the moment is combining both projects together to empower the community and try to resolve some of their environmental issues. So the pandemic for me has been a time to really focus on the legacy of these two lifelong projects, combining the two plants to create these two main problems, which are at the moment migration and erosion. And you could argue it's also about the erosion of culture in the village. So this is a quick video of what we're doing at the moment with a very ambitious reforestation project that we're doing with agaves. These are the same eroded fields that you saw Delfino talking about. So all of these rocks were covered by fertile soil about 15 years ago. These are some drone footage of the wild mountains in the background and the very eroded ones in the foreground. But I don't know if you can see these lines on the ground. All of these lines of holes that you see there are to basically slow down rainfall. At the moment, the problem is that because of climate change, we're experiencing really abundant rainfall all in one go, which erodes all of the soil. So what we've been doing for the past 6 years is to create all of these holes, which are dug in leveled lines. And if you can see there, they are starting to create green barriers. In between these green barriers, you're starting to see the first growth of shrubs, of some wild plants that were wiped out. And this is because all of these green lines are holes which have an agave planted on top of it. So this is a quick visualization that we did. This is actually a 3D scan of one of our agaves, which is sitting in front of this 1/2 meter deep holes that is capturing water. The water is being slowed down, and this water is slowly filtrating through the bedrock and onto the water table, which is in itself filling up the wells that are needed to irrigate our corn at the bottom of the mountains. Mm-hmm. So it's mixing both projects and combining them together to create a symbiotic, positive ecological effect. These are some more images of it from the ground. But I think what's important to notice here is the scale at which we're working. We are covering at the moment about 150 hectares of land. And we planted close to 50,000 agaves in the last 5 years. So it's really designed with a very, very long-term vision here. So I'm gonna switch to the next one. So essentially what we're doing here is to create a new design milpa, a symbiotic permaculture model that produces both food and material at a small scale and with maximum added value. So if you see these images, you have the agaves now being planted side by side with the corn. And so we have all of our production in the same field and with the same community. Just as a conclusion, as a wrap up to the presentation, I think what we can take from this is, and the messages that I try to communicate with my work, is that indigenous communities must be included in sustainability policy making decisions. They are the least contributors of climate change, and yet they're the first ones to suffer from it. And they are victims of globalization while being excluded from its advantages. And I think for me, a big sort of achievement in the project was to be invited to the World Economic Forum, which is sort of the playground of capitalists, to be able to talk about, the strategic side of what we're doing there. I was able to convince the forum to pay for also the trip of Delfino and Nicolas. For me, it was extremely important to create a platform where indigenous people would be represented, but where they could speak for themselves, not just speak through me. So it was a great achievement. It was the first trip they ever made outside of the country. And it was the first time that an indigenous Mexican was included in this conference. So for me, that was a great achievement for the project. So for me, in summary, the goal now is not about sustainability, but regeneration. I think we've gone too far to just be content with sustaining our current resources. It's really about creating more resources, more options for future generations. And I would also like to say that we can't solve the climate crisis without addressing the inequality crisis. Things won't change if the only way out of extreme poverty is to decimate your local natural resources. And I think we can't change the inequality crisis without addressing the ghosts of our colonial past. And I think this is where designers can really play a role in creating new radical systems and local economies that can really create change without the need of huge investment or without necessarily focusing on cutting edge new technology. It can be simple solutions. So that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Fernando. It's a really inspiring story and feels very promising. I would like to just remind everyone that you're welcome to ask questions. We have probably a good 20 minutes that we can keep talking with Fernando, but I will start off. I would love to just sort of clarify. So with the Total Mostly project, with the planting of corn, the corn itself is actually eaten and the leaves are used to make the materials. And the same with the agave?
The idea is to create independence from just being about selling the grain. So the grain is kept by the families for their own consumption to feed themselves. The agave is a different story because agave, you can only harvest it after 7 years. So we actually haven't really started harvesting most of them. We started really at a slow scale. And what you can do with, so traditionally, we started working with the waste of the mezcal industry. So we would go to mezcal plantations and we would use the leaves, which are waste, to make our fibers. Now our production is going to change because now we're at a point where we can start harvesting the agaves that we planted back in 2015. They're about to be ready. So we're going to use the fiber, and it's similar to the Totomoxle sort of model where we create a lot more revenue from the fibers. But then the core of the agave, we're thinking of selling it to mezcal producers. So, that won't go to waste either. We're going to use the whole plant, of course.
But do people use agave in subsistence farming as well, or it has to be processed in some way that it only makes sense in making mezcal or something?
Well, it's not food, so you can't eat the plant, but you can definitely use it for making syrups, for making this fermented.
But I mean, just like a regular person could make, say, the syrup out of it.
Yeah. You don't need a machine to turn it into syrup, no.
Okay, cool. And then, sorry, just one more sort of clarification because the process is just so interesting. With the planting project that's going on now, is it able to go back to that sort of original plan and like mixing in the greens and the squash and not having to rely on the pesticides and all as well? That's part of it as well.
Yeah, we went back to that. So if you see, if you notice on my last slide, the corn is actually really spaced out. And this is the thing. It's a system that has kind of disappeared because if you're trying to produce loads and loads and loads of corn, you need to plant it really tightly together. You need to use tractors to, harvest all of that. And obviously you can't plant all of these different plants because the tractor just, completely squashes everything. So, yeah, we went back to the milpa system. It's all harvested by hand. And so now we have this, design milpa, which is the 3 plant plus agave. Yeah.
Okay, great. It's really exciting. So then you got invited to Davos and we're presenting this, as you said, to the main capitalists of the world that make things happen. Did anything come of that? And I mean, not only at Davos, but you have talked about this project in a few venues. Do you see anyone else taking the system already and applying it in other places with other conditions, or is it still too new for that?
I think at the moment, we're more interested in exporting sort of the methodology of how you approach a problem like this, so that's why I really like giving these talks, because I think this is the way of maybe showing younger designers or engineers or whoever it is, how to perhaps have a strategy to empower a community with local resources. So it's not so much about saying, oh, let's start making, kilometers of totomoxle or, tons and tons.
I understand. Yeah. No, it seems like it would be a beautiful thing if it could show up in different climates and with different peoples and communities, applied as makes sense. But you haven't seen that actually start happening in specific yet.
Well, I know that there's more and more mezcal plantations that are starting to use the fibers. I don't know if that's as a direct inspiration from my project, but it's becoming a thing, because I think the mezcal industry is starting to realize that, they're throwing away really precious fibers actually. So you have there's a few mezcal plantations that are starting to do this for sure.
That's really cool. Well, you mentioned climate change a bit. I mean, I realize that the original problems with soil erosion were not necessarily because of climate change, but because of the sort of farming practices that were kind of imposed on the region. But I mean, climate change is moving very fast now. Have you seen changes in the 5 or 6, 7 years that you've been doing this already, where things are responding in a really different way, such as the rains you mentioned? Is that the main issue?
Yes, I mean, completely. We've had 6 years of drought, essentially. We have really violent rains, but for 1 week of the year, and then the rest is completely dry. And we've actually seen, so what we do every year as well is that we select our seeds. We improve the quality of our seeds, and we're making very drought resistant selections. But nonetheless, it's for example, our winter harvest is becoming really hard to do, and we're having much lower yields than in the summer because it's just not raining anymore in the winter. So it's a real problem, but it's a real problem that is made worse when you combine bad strategies that happened in the early 2000s with this incredibly quick change in climate. So I think, for me, this is the thing with the project. It's really about action rather than, raising awareness about something. It's really about being pragmatic and trying to make a change, at least in this village,
And I mean, have you had to raise outside funding to be able to work at the scale that you are on the mountains where the mudslides are happening? How are you making that happen? That must be part of what someone could take away and try to apply somewhere else, is how to fund that.
Yeah, Well, so far, I mean, I had a small funding from the Dutch government of all places, but you know, there was
They're very good with funding design
yeah,
projects.
they're amazing.
Yeah.
So far, nothing from the Mexican government,
That's
which
a
I'm
shame.
happy. I'm happy about that. Well, but it's complicated to deal with government. Is very complicated. So far, it's mostly the sales of the pieces, and I mean, it's kind of amazing actually how much that money can stretch when you go from, you know, selling a very expensive piece of furniture and then investing that into buying thousands of agaves or paying for people to go and plant them.
Yeah.
You actually can get a lot done, and I think this is part of what I want to show the project. It doesn't take huge investments. It just takes organization and energy, you know. But we are looking at basically getting certified as a carbon offsetting operation to be able to give carbon credits to companies that are trying to neutralize their emissions. The problem that we're facing right now is that so far there are no recognized protocols for reforestation for carbon offsetting that involve anything else but big trees.
Right.
So this is a problem because there's been a few reforestation attempts in nearby villages where the government just goes and pays them per tree planted. And they give them all these saplings of all these big leafy trees that obviously die within a few weeks because there's no water there.
Right.
So what we're trying to do is, and this will be a big thing if we manage to do it, is to get an internationally recognized protocol for being certified as a fundable carbon offsetting project using desertic plants. And this idea of desert reforestation is a very innovative new model,
right?
Which I think will be a big sort of score with the project. And this could be a much more impactful thing, because then you would get the certification path sort of paved for other villages or other regions to be able to raise funds this way.
Yeah. Do you think of this project, you had mentioned before about, you know, it's not just about sustainability, it's about regenerating, you know, resources. In your mind, just, do you feel like that's a matter of going backwards or going forwards, or both?
It's about looking at the past to see what was being done right.
Yeah.
What we lost that shouldn't have been lost, and how we can adapt that to these future challenges. But a lot of that is looking at our indigenous communities worldwide. You know, they are some of the most ignored sources of knowledge. You know?
Yeah.
And I think these are people that have to be heard, and these are people that need to be paid for their knowledge. You know, because unfortunately we brought them into this mess. We've introduced this capitalistic model that has been really making their life difficult. So the solutions also have to be economic solutions, and they need to get paid for this.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. There have been a number of questions added in here, so I'm going to read a few to you.
Okay.
What kind of glues do you use in the production of your marquetries, and do they smell of corn?
We use latex-based contact glue, which is water-based and natural latex. So you apply it to the corn leaf and you apply it to the other substrate. So sometimes we use recycled paper, or for example, for the wall tiles, we glue it onto cork sheets. And so, you know, you apply pressure and that's bonded. So that's the most eco-friendly glue that we found. And what's nice about it as well is that it's heat reversible. So if one day, for some reason, you need to recycle this and you want to recrush the cork, let's say, you apply heat above 80 degrees and then it comes apart. So so
that's cool.
That was a solution that we found for that. It doesn't smell like corn, but it smells more like cork.
Those are both good smells.
Yeah.
Okay, does your work with the local communities inspire others to rebel against the powers of global agricultural corporations? It's interesting.
I think it was more when I started the project, I was doing a residency in Oaxaca, which is a very kind of traditional area of Mexico. And back then there was a national-wide protest to encourage the Supreme Court in Mexico to rule against genetically modified grains in the country. And that was the sort of backdrop of when I was getting inspired to do this project. So no, it's not like my project has inspired this. There's already a big feeling in Mexico to address this, and actually all those protests were successful. There was a total ban on GMOs, not only corn but all GMOs in Mexico. They're completely forbidden. And Mexico is now, along with Bolivia, the two only countries in Latin America to have a total ban on GMOs. So it's a step in the right direction. But I think the solution has to be both political and economical. You know, it's a problem that is not only about politics. It's also about showing alternatives.
Yeah. Okay. Jules van der Lagenberg wrote, thank you for the presentation. Besides the communication values, what are the economic outcomes for the people involved and yourself when it comes to lecturing about the project or selling small-scale crafted pieces? It's a two-part question, but I guess maybe you could just sort of go over again, like, it sounds like they've been lifted, that the community has experienced some more economic freedom. Do you feel like it's scalable? I mean, how is that working for you?
Yeah, so we pay them about 5 times the local wages around there. So if you want to talk about economic benefits for them, we're paying them 5 times the minimum wage, the national minimum wage. So that's huge. No one gets paid that in this area. Obviously, I also live off that, you know, so it's a win-win thing. And I think, I mean, this is a true collaboration. We want to make it fair for everyone. What's the second part of the question?
The second part of the question is, what are the relevant venues for presentation and selling the objects and other outcomes of your working methods, from regional markets to limited edition design fairs?
So we have almost like 2 lines in regards with the corn and also with the agave now. So we have the very limited edition or unique pieces, which are collectible design pieces, which we sell through the galleries. And those are really bespoke pieces. But then, for example, the wall tiles we sell by the square meter, and we ship worldwide, and it's, you know, a very accessible price for, you know, Europeans and Americans. We're not really selling at local market level yet, because it is expensive for the Mexican economy or buying power. But, and I know that might sound a little bit wrong, but what we try to do is to say, okay, our productions are still fair, you know, somewhat limited. We can't produce, you know, hundreds and thousands of tons of this thing. So we really want to make the most added value possible, especially at, you know, this initial stages of the project, because it's only that way that we can guarantee very well paid, you know, labor, and also to be able to finance all of these other costs that are not necessarily about production, but about this long-term ecological recovery.
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be tough that, you know, with any design project, you know, is it accessible to, you know, a mass audience, or are the people producing it being treated well or paid well, and, you know, the materials are sustainable? Like, it's a major heart of design problem right now. I guess that is all we have in there. Anyone, feel free to ask. I can ask one more question. In the meantime, sorry, feel free to add one more question to the chat box, but I will just ask, besides the 2 projects you presented, are there other things that you're working on now that are new and that you'd like to share?
I'm working with avocados. That's going to be my next focus. It's continuing on this, you know, methodology of looking at these problematics at a local level because of global consumption. It's a very, very hot topic about the ethics behind the production of avocados and the all of the sudden overconsumption worldwide. It's still too early to say what it's going to be, but I've been working on this for 2 years already on the research side, and we're starting to produce at the moment. But you know, with many of my projects, I take years before I really publish something. So
No, that makes sense.
you know, it's not going to come anytime soon, but we're working on that.
That's cool. All right. Well, then I will end with one last question from me. Does this project, or what other projects out there that you see that you're not even working on, give you the most hope for the future? I mean, we have terrible things barreling down on us from all directions. Where are you finding hope these days? Or not? I don't know. If you're not, you can say so as well.
No, I am. I mean, I think we're starting to question a lot of the relationships between developed countries and countries in development. And I think we are really questioning this idea, at least in the developing world, quote unquote, developing towards what? You know, right. I think we're in places like Latin America, like Africa. I think these are going to be really the places where the most innovative solutions are going to come. The places where ideas are really going to be applied and taken and delivered within. You know, this is where you can really make big change. This is really where you can act and have profound effects very quickly. So Latin America gives me a lot of hope. Mexico gives me a lot of hope. I think we're starting to realize that it's not about imitating what's happening in America or in Europe. We need to look for our own solutions, and there's a lot of exciting projects just by having this fresh view on things.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. All right, then. Well, thank you so much, Fernando. I mean, your work is just always gorgeous and inspiring. So thank you for your time. And thanks to everyone who tuned in to watch this great talk. This is the last one in dieDAS's Walk and Talk program this year. So also thank you to dieDAS for inviting me, and have a great day or night, wherever you might be in the world. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.